Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last episode, Axel finally gave in to his terrible hunger, despite the fact he had 2 dinners, or lunches basically, and told his uncle what the key to the cipher was. And now they are going to finally eat some food, and they're going to discuss this over supper. Obviously, by the name of the chapter, you'll discover Axel is going to do everything he can to get his uncle to not go on this journey. But, spoiler alert, the name of the book is Journey to the Center of the Earth. So, I don't think he's going to do a good job. But anyway, we're going to hear some great arguments and figure out exactly what that whole clue really meant. Because there was a lot of words in there that I did not know. I'm sure many of you didn't either. Because I feel like they may have been made up. We'll find out in chapter 6. So let's enjoy together. Chapter 6. I argue in vain. At these words, a shudder went through the whole of my body. However, I controlled myself and even decided to put on a good face. I knew that only scientific arguments could stop Professor Liedenbrock. Luckily, there were plenty of good ones against the practicality of such a journey. To go to the center of the earth? What a crazy idea! But I kept my dialectics for a suitable opportunity and gave the whole of my attention to the business of eating. There would be no point in repeating my uncle's curses when he saw the empty table. An explanation was given, and Martha set at liberty. She ran to the market and managed so well that an hour later my hunger had been appeased, and I became aware of the situation once more. During the meal, my uncle was almost merry, and indulged in some of those learned jokes which never do anybody harm. After dessert, he beckoned me to follow him into his study. I obeyed. He sat down at one end of the table, I at the other. "Axel," he said in quite a gentle voice, "you are a very clever young man, and you have done me a great service when, tired of trying, I was going to give up that combination. What mightn't I have tried next? I shall never forget that, my boy, and you shall have your share in the glory we are going to win." Splendid, I thought. He's in a good mood. Now's the time to discuss that glory he mentions. "Above all," my uncle went on, "I insist on absolute secrecy, you understand? I have plenty of envious rivals in the world of science who would only be too eager to undertake this journey, but they mustn't hear about it until we are back." "Do you really think," I asked, "that there are many who would be bold enough to risk it?" "Of course! Who would hesitate at the thought of winning such fame? If this document were made public, a whole army of geologists would rush up to follow in Arne Saknussem's footsteps." "I'm not so sure of that, Uncle, for there's nothing to prove that document is genuine." "What? And what about the book we found it in?" "Oh, I grant you that Saknussemm wrote those lines, but does it follow that he really performed the journey? May not this old parchment be just a hoax?" I almost regretted making this last, rather foolhardy remark. The professor bent his shaggy brows, and I was afraid that I had compromised the rest of the conversation. Fortunately, I was mistaken. A hint of a smile touched the lips of my solemn companion, and he replied, "We shall see." "Ah," I said, rather put out. "But allow me to list all the possible objections to this document." "Speak out, my boy. Don't be afraid. You are perfectly free to express your opinion. I no longer regard you as my nephew, but as my colleague. So go on." "Well, first I should like to ask you what these names, Yokul, Sneffels, and Scartaris mean, because I've never heard of them before." Well, that is an easy question to answer. As it happens, I recently received a map from my friend Augustus Petermann of Leipzig, which could not have arrived at a better time. Take down the third atlas in the second section of the big bookcase, Series Z, fourth shelf. I stood up and with the help of these precise instructions soon found the required atlas. My uncle opened it and said, "Here is one of the best maps of Iceland, Henderson's, and I think it will give us the solution to all your difficulties." I bent over the map. "You can see that there are volcanoes all over the island," said the professor, "and you will notice that they all bear the name Jökull. That word means glacier in Icelandic. And at that high latitude, most eruptions take place through layers of ice. Hence, the term Jökull, which is applied to all the volcanic mountains in Iceland." "I see," I replied. "But what is Sneffels?" I was hoping that there would be no answer to this question, but I was disappointed. My uncle went on. "Follow my finger along the west coast of Iceland. You see Reykjavik, the capital? Good. Well, go up the countless fjords that start from this shore eaten away by the sea, and stop just below the 65th degree of latitude. What do you see there?" "A sort of peninsula that looks like a bone with a huge kneecap at the end of it." "Quite a good comparison, my boy. Now, can you see anything on that kneecap?" "Yes, a mountain, which looks as if it had grown out of the sea." "Good. Well, that is Sneffels." "That?" "Yes, that. It's a mountain 5,000 feet high, one of the most remarkable on the island, and undoubtedly destined to be the most famous in the world if its crater leads to the center of the globe." "But that's impossible," I said, shrugging my shoulders in disgust at such a ridiculous idea. "Impossible?" said the Professor Liedenbrock in a stern voice. "And why should that be impossible?" "Because the crater must be full of lava and burning rocks, and in that case—" "But what if it's an extinct volcano?" "Extinct?" "Yes. The number of active volcanoes in the world is now only about 300, but there is a far greater number of extinct volcanoes, and Sneffels is one of these. It has had only one eruption known to history, and that was in 1229. After that, it gradually calmed down, and at present it is no longer counted among active volcanoes." I could make no reply to such positive statements, and I therefore fell back on the other obscure aspects of the document. "Well, what does the word Scartaris mean?" I asked, "and where do the Kalends of July come into all of this?" My uncle considered for a few moments. I felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived, for soon he answered, "What is obscure to you is crystal clear to me. This proves the ingenious care with which Saknussemm described his discovery. Sneffels has several craters, and it was therefore necessary to indicate the one which leads to the center of the earth. What did the learned Icelander do? He observed that at the approach of the Kalends of July, in other words, towards the end of June, one of the peaks of the mountain, a peak called Scartaris, cast its shadow as far as the mouth of the crater in question, and he recorded that fact in his document. Nothing could be more precise, and when we reach the summit of Sneffels, we shall have no hesitation as to which way to go." My uncle certainly had an answer to everything. I saw that I could not shake him as far as the words on an old parchment were concerned. I therefore stopped pressing him on that subject, and since the most important thing was to convince him, I went on to the scientific objections, which in my opinion were much more serious. "All right," I said. "I have to admit that Saknussemm's sentence is quite clear and leaves no room for doubt. I'll even grant that the document seems perfectly genuine. The old savant went to the bottom of Sneffels. He saw the shadow of Scartaris touched at the edge of the crater before the Kalends of July. He even heard tell in the legendary stories of his day that the crater led to the center of the earth. But for as his having gone down there and come back alive, no, 100 times no." "And why not?" asked my uncle in an extremely sarcastic voice. Because all the theories of science prove that a feat of that sort is impossible. Oh, so all the theories prove that, do they? What wicked theories they are. What a nuisance they are going to be. I saw that he was making fun of me, but I went on all the same. Yes, it is generally recognized that the temperature rises about 1 degree for every 70 feet below the surface, so that if you admit that ratio to be constant, the radius of the Earth being over 4,000 miles, the temperature at the center must be over 2 million degrees. Consequently, all the substances inside the Earth must be in a state of incandescent gas, for gold, platinum, and even the hardest rocks cannot resist such a temperature. I therefore have good grounds as for asking, how could it be possible to penetrate so far? So it's the temperature that worries you, Axel. Of course it is. If we were to go only 25 miles down, we should have reached the limit of the Earth's crust, for the temperature there is over 1,300 degrees. And you are afraid of melting away? I leave you to answer that question, I retorted rather crossly. This is my answer, said Professor Liedenbrock, taking on his most superior air. Neither you nor anybody else knows for certain what is going on inside the Earth, seeing that we have penetrated only about 1/12,000th part of its radius. What is more, science is eminently perfectible, and each new theory is soon disproved by a newer one. Wouldn't it generally be believed until Fourier that the temperature of interplanetary space steadily decreased? And don't we know now that the lowest temperature in the ethereal regions is never below 40 or 50 degrees below zero? Why shouldn't the same be true of the internal temperature? Why, at a certain depth, shouldn't it reach an impassable limit, instead of rising to the melting point of the most resistant minerals? As my uncle was now putting the question on a hypothetical plane, I had nothing to say in reply. Well, let me tell you that some real scientists, including Poisson, had proved that if a temperature of 2 million degrees existed inside the globe, the fiery gases given off by the melted matter would acquire such an elasticity that the Earth's crust would be unable to resist it, and that it would explode like the plates of a bursting boiler. That's Poisson's opinion, Uncle, nothing more. Granted. But it is also the opinion of other distinguished geologists that the interior of the globe is composed of neither gas nor water, nor of the heaviest minerals known to us, for in that case the Earth would weigh half as much as it does. Oh, you can prove anything with figures. But can you do the same with facts? Isn't it a fact that the number of volcanoes has greatly diminished since the beginning of the world? And may we not conclude that if there is heat in the center, it is decreasing? Uncle, if you're going to enter the region of speculation, I have nothing more to say. But I have something to say, namely that the greatest authorities share my opinion. Do you remember a visit the famous English chemist Humphrey Davy paid me in 1825? No, I don't. For the very good reason that I wasn't born until 19 years later. Well, Humphrey Davy came to see me on his way through Hamburg. Among the questions, we spent a long time discussing the hypothesis of the liquid nature of the terrestrial nucleus. We were agreed that this liquidity could not exist, for a reason which science has never been able to refute. What reason is that? I asked with a certain astonishment. Because this liquid mass would be subject, like the sea, to the attraction of the moon, and consequently twice a day there would be infernal tides which, pushing up the Earth's crust, would cause periodical earthquakes. Yet it is obvious, I said, that the surface of the globe has been subjected to the action of fire, and it is reasonable to suppose that the outer crust cooled down first, while the heat took refuge in the center. You are mistaken there, replied my uncle. The Earth was heated by the combustion of its surface and nothing else. Its surface was composed of a greater number of metals, such as potassium and sodium, which have the peculiar property of igniting at the mere contact with air and water. These metals caught fire when the atmospheric vapors fell in the form of rain on the soil, and little by little, when the waters penetrated into the fissures of the Earth's crust, they started fresh fires together with explosions and eruptions, hence the large number of volcanoes during the early period of the Earth. I must say, that's an ingenious theory, I exclaimed, rather in spite of myself. And one which Humphrey demonstrated to me, here in this very room, with a simple experiment. He made a small ball largely composed of the metals I mentioned just now, which was the perfect image of our globe. When he sprayed its surface with a fine rain, it blistered, became oxidized, and formed a miniature mountain. A crater formed at the mountain's summit, and an eruption took place, making the whole ball so hot you couldn't hold it in your hand. I began to be shaken by the professor's arguments, which he put forward incidentally with all his usual ardor and enthusiasm. As you can see, Axel, he added, the state of the terrestrial nucleus has given rise to a variety of theories among geologists. Nothing is less certain than the existence of that internal heat you believe in. My own view is that it doesn't exist, and couldn't possibly exist. But in any case, we shall see for ourselves, and like Arnesak Newsom, we shall know what to think about this important question. All right, I replied, carried away by his enthusiasm. We shall see. That is, if it's possible to see anything there. And why shouldn't it be possible? May we not count on electrical phenomena to give us light, and even on the atmosphere whose pressure may render it luminous as we approach the center? Yes, I said, that is just possible, I suppose. It is certain, my uncle retorted triumphantly. But silence, you understand, silence about all this, so that nobody has the idea of trying to reach the center of the earth before us. And that's the end of chapter 6. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories. But until then, be well and sleep well.